She screamed and fought, her small legs flailing in the air, while he dragged her into the truck. Those are the haunting words of a young witness, memories buried for half a century. In less than 5 minutes between her front door and the sidewalk, 9-year-old Debbie Randall, who had promised to be home before dinner, vanished from Marietta, Georgia, on a cold winter evening in 1972. Her partially clothed body was found in the woods 16 days later, strangled with her own jacket. For more than 50 years, Debbie remained frozen in time as a 9-year-old child while her killer lingered in the shadows, like a ghost. That is, until a long-buried secret, hidden in the evidence, finally spoke. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our latest stories. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the office of Detective Morris Nix, slicing through dusty window panes and casting a muted, somber light. The only sound could be heard in the steady, rounded tick-tock of an old wall clock marking the slow passage of hours. Morris leaned back in his worn leather chair, gray eyes scanning the towering stacks of files on his desk. Each one was a forgotten case, a delayed justice that had haunted him throughout his career. A soft knock broke the silence. Detective Scott stepped in, clutching a thin white folder in his hand. Morris didn't even need to ask. He knew this folder held something explosive. "We have the results from DNA Labs International," Scott said, his voice a little shaky. "They've completed the genetic genealogy analysis on the Debbie Randall case." Morris froze, eyes fixed on the folder. Anticipation and dread pulsed through him. He had spent his life on cases like this, but he had never dared believe a report might actually bring answers. "We have a name, sir," Scott continued, handing over the file. "The suspect has been identified as William B. Rose from Mableton." The name echoed in the office, strange and unfamiliar. Morris closed his eyes briefly and let the words sink into his mind. The name opened a floodgate of memories he thought he had locked away. He remembered 2001, the day he first came across Debbie Randall's file buried in a pile of cold cases. A vibrant little girl full of dreams, snatched away on a frigid winter evening, only half a block from her home. If she had lived, Debbie would be older than Morris now. But fate had locked her forever as a 9-year-old. Her tragic death had haunted an entire community, and it had haunted him. His gut had always told him that something crucial in the original investigation had been missed. He had reopened the case, pulling out the evidence box that had been gathered and then tucked away for decades. Inside was a single strand of unidentified hair, the only piece of evidence from the brutal crime. Morris had sent it to the FBI. They ran every test they could, but the technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to crack the case. He had waited for the day when science could finally speak. And now the name William B. Rose rang out, sudden, sharp, concrete. It was the voice of the DNA evidence Morris had waited decades to hear, ever since the day he promised Debbie he would bring the truth home. He pulled the faded case file that he had inherited in 2001, every word transporting him back to Marietta, Georgia. August 1962, the day a baby girl named Debbie Randall drew her first breath. She was the daughter of John and Onetta Randall. Raised in a tight-knit, friendly town, Marietta had still maintained its quaint southern charm. Though it was embracing a modern pulse, Debbie was a third grader at Pine Forest Elementary. With her sweet and gentle nature, she was loved by her classmates, and more generally, the community cherished her. She had received many dolls from visitors, a small testament to the affection she inspired. Debbie also had an older brother, Melvin, and their bond was special. Melvin would always dote on his little sister, striving to make her happy. Whatever Debbie wished for, Melvin made it happen, a clear indication of the strong and loving relationship between them. Debbie was the joy of her family, a bright, adventurous little girl with big dreams. Yet her life was tragically cut short, never given the chance to chase those dreams or experience the fullness of life. It was a typical evening on Friday, January 13th, 1972. Debbie was at home in Marietta, Georgia, along with her mother, Onetta, and her older brother, Melvin, who wasn't feeling well, and was resting in his room. Everything was as it should be. Onetta was in the kitchen, preparing supper, while John, Debbie's dad, hadn't returned home from work yet. In an excited flurry, Debbie burst into the room. She changed her clothes and then came back to ask her mother if she could go play at the playground with some of her friends. The playground was just half a block away, only 57 feet from their home. Across the street, a laundromat caught Oneda's eye. She remembered that she had forgotten to pick up some detergent. So when she agreed to let Debbie go, she added a simple errand. "Honey," she said, "when you go out, don't forget to pick up the detergent we need." Debbie nodded with a joyful smile, promising to be back before dinner, and skipped off to join her friends. What the family didn't know at that moment was that that simple trip would start a mystery that would haunt them for decades. The playground was just a 5-minute walk for Debbie. She usually played an hour and then headed home, so Oneida expected her back in roughly an hour and a half. But 2 hours passed without Debbie returning. Oneida tried imagining she was at the laundromat, perhaps held up by a small crowd. 3 hours passed, and the sun set. Anxiety gnawed at her. This was unlike Debbie, always punctual, always careful. At 9:45 p.m., John came home. Onata's uneasiness could no longer be held inside. She asked him if he saw Debbie on the way home. His face reflected her fear. He had no information, no clue where their daughter might be. A nagging feeling of apprehension had grown to full-blown fear. Their beloved daughter was nowhere to be found. Her parents had begun calling out her name, prompting Melvin to come from his room. He could see the tension etched across their faces. "What's going on?" he asked, concerned. Torn between protecting her ailing son and facing her fear, Oneida finally spoke. Debbie hadn't come home. She and John were going out to look for her. Her heart heavy, Oneida asked Melvin to stay at the house, watch over it, and immediately notify them if Debbie should turn up. It was a moment of heartbreaking decisions, one that no family should ever face. Fear and confusion rippled through the neighborhood as the Randalls sprang into action. Melvin, devoted and desperate, couldn't bear to sit idle. He roamed the streets asking everyone he saw, "Have you seen Debbie? Do you know where she is?" The answers were chilling. Nobody had seen her. Some remembered catching sight of her as she was leaving the house. But after that, she had disappeared. Meanwhile, Oneida and John ran to the playground, but it was eerily empty. All the other children had gone home. Then they went to the laundromat, but it too was dark and locked. Every empty road, every quiet street they searched seemed to amplify the silence of their daughter's absence. Then Oneida saw something that made her stomach drop. A box of detergent scattered on the path leading back home. A terrible realization began to settle over her. Something awful may have taken place. Dread overcome, she could not hold back her tears. Oneida's heart was trembling as she made the tough decision of filing a missing persons report, knowing full well she had to do everything humanly and spiritually possible to find her little girl. Determined to do everything in her power, Oneida forged ahead against the weight of crushing uncertainty. The police indicated that since less than 24 hours had passed since Debbie's disappearance, they couldn't officially open a missing persons file, but they promised to do everything possible to search for her. Although this was a setback, what really warmed the Randalls' hearts was the outpouring from the community in support. Neighbors and strangers alike went into action, starting a citywide search that finally drew approximately 4,000 volunteers. Melvin, unable to sit still, hit the streets himself, plastering flyers with desperate pleas for any information about his missing sister. Debbie loved playing baseball with him, and he dearly missed her. Melvin hoped that somewhere, someone had seen something, anything, that could bring her home. The police, just as determined, followed every lead they received. They went to the laundromat and were able to confirm that Debbie was inside and did indeed pick up the detergent as instructed. But the most critical question could still not be clearly answered. What happened in the 5-minute space between her visit to the laundromat and her disappearance? They talked to every child at the playground that day, but none knew anything about Debbie. 16 long, agonizing days passed with no sign of Debbie. But on through those dark hours, Onta and John held to hope, waiting anxiously for their beloved daughter to come home. Among the dedicated searchers were a group of Southern Tech students who tirelessly assisted the police. Then on January 29, 1972, their persistence finally led to a tragic discovery. They found Debbie's lifeless, partially clothed body across a wooded area on Johnson Ferry Road. Her small frame showed evidence of a violent struggle, as if she had fought with every ounce of her young strength to protect herself. It appeared the cruel killer had used Debbie's own jacket to silence her cries. Investigators believed that the perpetrator most probably had been stalking for some time, awaiting the opportune moment, which he seized in those few heart-stopping minutes. Abducting her, subjecting her to unspeakable terrors in various locations, and finally discarding her lifeless body in the woods. The tragic finding caused shockwaves within this small community. Debbie's parents were overcome with emotion upon seeing their darling girl, dead and battered. The autopsy showed she had been strangled, then assaulted, with deep bruising indicating the extent of her suffering. This would yield one important piece of evidence during the examination: a single unidentified hair, most probably from her attacker. However, forensic technology during the 1970s was very limited, and nothing could be done then. The hair was preserved with great care, a small silent witness waiting for the day when science could finally speak. Days turned into months, and detectives pursued hundreds of leads relentlessly, with each one turning out to be frustratingly fruitless. The case seemed caught in a loop, with the crucial clue always just out of reach. But for the Randalls, with every question that wasn't answered, it was a fresh wound. What really happened that night? Who was responsible for their daughter's death? They wrestled not only with the profound grief of losing Debbie, but also with the gnawing frustration of justice slipping through their fingers. For 43 years, the case languished in the archives, as if it had left an unhealed scar on the community and within her family's heart. Yet Detective Morris Nix had never completely let go of the cold case files of Debbie Randall that had troubled him since 2001. Not until he volunteered for the Cobb County Cold Case Unit in 2015 did the chance arise to breathe new life into that investigation. Morris knew a bold approach was needed to break the decades-long stalemate. This time he decided to bring the case into the public eye, a move that quickly began to yield results. A woman named Sandra Walker came forward. She had been one of those children who played with Debbie on that fateful evening of January 13th, 1972. With a determination in her voice, she started recalling those long-ago memories, including narrowly avoiding being hit by a stranger's car and recalling the stranger's eyes, particulars that would prove vital to reopening the investigation. The memories never faded for Sandra Walker. She could still see the terrified face, still hear the desperate screams, and above all, the haunting image of her small legs flailing as she was dragged into the truck. Those visions had stayed with her for a lifetime. To provoke new interest and reenact the scene, police teamed up with multiple artists. Among them was graphic designer Jessica Null, who brought a new eye to the composite. She mentioned the old road was now a bus route. Amanda Wood is a freelance artist who has spent months reimagining Debbie's final moments. The child as a doll, up against a monstrous figure. This emotionally charged depiction resonated with the public, bringing in new leads in the investigation. For over 40 years, John Randall, Debbie's father, had kept every newspaper clipping in a faded shoebox. Onta, her mother, maintained a small shrine in their living room with Debbie's picture. Every article, every headline wasn't just a memory. It was a symbol of unbroken hope, a promise that the world would never forget their daughter. "Sir," Scott's voice suddenly brought Morris back to the present, "there's still one more important thing I haven't told you." And with that, his voice carried weight. Filled with much trepidation, Morris looked up, meeting Scott's gaze. He knew his partner wasn't given to dramatics. If he stumbled over words, the news was serious. Scott took a deep breath. William B. Rose. He died in November 1974, suicide, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. The words were like a physical blow to Morris. Justice, so tantalizingly close, had slipped through their fingers, bitter and hollow. The revelation was almost cruel. The killer had paid a price, but not in a courtroom. Scott continued, offering a theory. "We believe Rose's death was driven by fear. He had a history of alcohol-related arrests, and a family member once told police he lived in constant paranoia. Perhaps he feared that someday the truth about Debbie would surface, and he chose to end it before that could happen. The key is, he was never on our original suspect list." Morris stared at the file. the name William B. Rose etched in black and white, a phantom connection, a haunting possibility. But the seasoned detective was cautious. "This is only genealogical analysis," he said gravely. "We need irrefutable proof. How can we be sure it's him based on a family tree?" Scott nodded to indicate that he understood the skepticism. "That's right, sir. To eliminate all doubt and give Debbie's family absolute certainty, we propose the next step, obtaining permission from the Rose family. We'll request an exhumation of his remains for a direct DNA comparison. It's the only way to definitively confirm William B. Rose as the perpetrator." Morris didn't speak for a moment. Exhuming a body after almost 5 decades was a big decision. There needed to be family consent and a great deal of procedural formality, but he'd see it through if it was the only route to bringing the truth finally to Debbie and her family. "Do it," said Morris decisively. "Get everything ready." 2 days later, the sky over Oak Grove Cemetery in Marietta hung heavy and gray, drizzling cold rain. Morris and Scott stood under black umbrellas, watching the crew exhuming with care the age plot marked only by William B. Rose's simple headstone. The air was thick with solemnity, a strange sense of history unfolding. A chill ran through Morris not from the rain, but from the thought of the monster who had buried this heinous secret for decades. The Rose family had agreed, but their consent came with pain and a heavy layer of suspicion. When the coffin was brought up and samples of bone and teeth were carefully collected, Morris quietly left. He didn't need to watch the whole process. His job now was to wait, and wait he did. Days turned into interminable weeks, with each phone call and knock at his office door causing him to jump. The samples had been sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab, where scientists worked around the clock, comparing every strand of DNA from Rose's remains to the fragile hair preserved from Debbie Randall's body. Morris knew this was more than a technical analysis. It was the answer to a question that had plagued him for decades, the truth that could finally bring closure to Debbie's family. After decades of relentless pain, a final chapter was at last within reach. The phone call awakened Morris early that frosty morning, when thin sheets of ice clung to the window panes. "It was the head of the DNA testing team from the GBI," he answered, voice hoarse from long nights and anxious anticipation. "Morris Nix here," he said. On the other end, every word had lifted layers of stone that had pressed down on his heart for years. "Detective Nix," the professional voice full of confidence said, "we are done with the analysis. The DNA sample from William B. Rose matches perfectly with the hair found on Debbie Randall's body. Leaves no room for doubt. William B. Rose is the one who tragically took the life of the 9-year-old girl." Morris hung up. For a long moment, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. He exhaled, a deep, full release. That name, William B. Rose, was no longer a possibility, no longer a theory. It was irrefutable truth. After over 50 years, finally, Debbie Randall got her justice, and Morris Nix had kept his word. With evidence in hand, Morris knew he had to undertake the most important meeting of his career. He drove to the home of Melvin Randall, Debbie's older brother. Now, in his 60s, his hair was silver, and his face lined with the years of carrying the burden of a brother's grief. But his eyes still held the raw hurt of a brother who lost his sister. Morris sat opposite him, eyes full of empathy. He didn't want to prolong the agony. "Melvin," he started, voice low, weighted with solemnity and quiet hope, "we finally found the person who did this to Debbie." He stopped and allowed it to sink in. "DNA, modern science, helped us. The perpetrator was William B. Rose. He lived right here in Mableton, near your family's old neighborhood." His voice softened as Morris delivered the hardest part. "There's something else, too. Rose is dead. He committed suicide in November 1974, just 2 years after taking Debbie. He lived in fear that his crime would be exposed, and he ended it himself." His eyes locked on Melvin's, the weight of what he had to say settling between them. "To be absolutely sure, we exhumed his body after almost 5 decades. With permission, the DNA results are irrefutable. Rose was the one who harmed Debbie." The silence in the room was loud and clear. Tears traced paths down Melvin's weathered cheeks. He finally looked up, voice trembling, raw but sincere, carrying both relief and deep regret. If only you'd come a year earlier. My father might have found some peace before he passed, he choked out. I waited my whole life for this. I know my parents are with Debbie in heaven now. And finally, it's over. We pray Debbie's spirit can finally find eternal peace. Melvin bowed his head, clasping his hands as if to contain the last of his tears. The small room was heavy with memories, yet brightened by the truth finally delivered. Morris silently rose and laid a hand on Melvin's shoulder. It was a touch that spoke volumes, needed no elaboration. Some truths, once spoken, can only lengthen the pain. He walked out the wooden door, leaving behind a family that had just found closure after half a century of waiting. Outside, dusk had fallen. The sky was painted in pale violet, the wind crisp yet gentle. Morris looked up and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, there was a void in his life, and it wasn't heavy with cold case files or questions that went unanswered. Rather, it was the quiet, open space where finally some peace could settle. Justice hadn't come from a courtroom, but it had spoken. In that moment, Morris knew Debbie's spirit had finally found its way home. Thanks so much for your presence and for listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for updates on our latest stories. Stay safe and cherish the time with your loved ones.